But the 47 floods are particularly relevant to me because I was just about around. My mum apparently said, if it rains one more day, you're going to get wet. But particularly because I knew nothing about them until I attended a WEA meeting in Hadnam. And somebody said, did you know that in 1947 we lost 100 square miles of fen? And I said, no, that can't have happened, but it did. So let's start by actually looking at the area that we're talking about. We're talking about Cambridgeshire. We're talking about the fen land. Now, this is a map of the fens in about 1605, before the fens were drained. It's a difficult map to find your way around because it's got north to the right. So you have to imagine it stood on end. If you imagine it stood on end, then you've got Cambridge on the left, and to the north you've got Wisbech and King's Lynn. The fens, as you can see, are like a saucer. There's two colours on this map. There's white colour and grey colour. White colour is highland, grey colour is fenland. The fens are like a saucer. They're high all the way around the outside and they're low in the middle. And water, when it falls on the rim of a saucer, can drain down to the bottom. And the bottom is the fen. And standing out of the fen, like little lumps of sugar, are white bits. And it's on the white bits, the islands, that people lived. And my island is on the island of Ely in the centre of the map. Now the fens have of course been tamed and drained, and the talking of the fen drainage and fen taming is a topic that would take far longer than we can try today. So let's just concentrate on 1947. If you remember 1947, what you remember is the cold. That just froze and that froze and that froze, and that would never warm up. And then on the top of that frozen ground, you got snow. And it snowed and it snowed and it snowed. And if you got snow and you're a little old kid, that's wonderful, because you can have snowball fights. Or you can get a bit of corrugated tin and carry it up to the top of that Cherry Hill in Ely, which is the one that William the Conqueror built to put his castle on after that's not flooding, that's something else. That's another story for another day. And if you got snow, you can make snowmen. You can make the biggest snowman in the world. You've got the biggest snowman's body, you've got the biggest snowman's head. All you've got to do is to put the head on that body and your mum calls. You got to go to bed. I don't want to go to bed, I want to finish my snowman. You got to go to bed. Your snowman will be there in the morning. But it wasn't, because the story of 1947 is an awful lot of snow on frozen ground and a quick thaw. And when snow thaws, it melts and it flows down the hills into the rivers. And to the south of Cambridgeshire, the water carried the snow into their streams, and their streams carry it into the fenland rivers. As part of the drainage of the fens, two giant rivers were dug in the 1600s to take the water that had come from Bedford straight out to sea, towards the sea, to a place called Denver, in two massive man-made rivers. Man-made rivers that have high banks on the outside. The importance of those banks is that they keep the water in. The problem in 1947 was compounded by the fact that there was a high tide in the Wash, and it was difficult for that water to get away. And so the water in the rivers filled up until it overflowed to the top of the banks. And when you get a situation like that, what you want is a quiet night. Now you've got to have men patrolling the banks. And if a bank's going to burst, it's never going to burst at 2:30 in the afternoon. So at 2:30 in the morning. You said goodbye to your dad, goodbye to your brother, and he's setting off into that blackness of the fen night. On a situation like that, what they wanted was a quiet night. What they got was a gale that flooded across the fen, a gale that whipped up that water that was in the rivers and threw it against that last little bit of bank that was left. And in all those hundreds of miles of dikes and banks, something has to go wrong. And one of the places it went wrong was at the village of Over. And I've spoken to Marshal Ingle, who was one of the men involved in what happened at Over. We'll look, to put it in context with this aerial photograph. The aerial photograph shows Erith. Erith is at the start of what is now the two big Bedford rivers that's carrying the water that's coming from the left out to sea. To the left of Erith, you've got Plantisham, and along the line of the river, you've got Sharps's Corner. Marshall said, I was standing on the road by that pump, and I was looking along the river, and the pump driver, he said to me, Marshall, your eyesight's better than mine. Look along that river. Look along to Sharps's Corner. Is that snow laying on the bank? Or is water coming across the river? Is the bank gone? Marshall said, no, mate, the bank's burst. Well, blast, we got problems. The best thing you can do is go to Over village and get the men out. Marshall said, I drove as fast as I could to the village of Over. I was 6:30 on the Sunday evening. They were just singing the first hymns at the Baptist chapel. I hammered on the door, said, I don't want to disturb the congregation, pastor, but we reckon the bank's going to burst. Sharps's Corner. Can you men, can you get out your Sunday togs? Can you get in your working togs? Can you get down Sharps's Corner? You know where it is. You take that concrete road, the one we put in the fen during the war, and get to the, then you'll find there's a drove. A drove leads you up to the bank. Go up to the bank. When you get to the bank, turn right, walk along there for about a mile and out into the blackness of that night, men headed. When they finally got to where the action was taking place, the river bank was 16 foot higher than the ground was, and almost vertical. We had to clamber to the top of that bank, and when we got to the top of the bank, we could see what had happened. There was a dip in the top of the bank. That's where the cattle had crossed, and where the cattle had crossed, they'd worn it down, and all we had to do was to make it up. But we couldn't do it, because the soil was down there and it was frozen solid. And by the time we chiselled a bit of soil out and carried it up that bank in a face for gale, by the time we'd spread it in where that gap was, that gap was getting bigger faster than we could fill it. And we was down there and the bank was up there and water was coming across the top of that bank and drenching us. And that weren't just water, that were trees. Trees were crashing down. And the engineer said, look lads, we can't hold this. We're going to die here. The best thing we can do is get back to Over village and come back one morning. So they picked up their shovels, they picked up their spades, they hobbled back to Over, and next morning they came back. Except they didn't, because they couldn't get back. Because the only way there was on that concrete road, and that concrete road was now underwater. And if they could have got back, this is what they found. That 16-foot high bank had gone. There was just a massive gap. And the water that had been held up in the rivers to the right was now flooding through that gap. If you stood on the bank, it was like you were at a railway crossing and an express train were coming through. The whole bank was trembling. There's nothing you can do. When water is coming through the bank, that's flooding in Over fen. People said, well, that's the best thing that could do, because other fen has never been any good. Other fen was only slub and muck. We're sorry you're flooded and there ain't many houses, but because you're flooded, you've taken the pressure off the rest of the system. Other areas will be safe because of your sacrifice. We now just move to the road that leads from Willingham towards, from Erith towards Willingham and over. That runs along the bank of what we call the Old West River, which was once the Great Ouse until they dug those new rivers. Along this road bank, the road runs on the top of the riverbank. Now in 1947, that river was full from brim to brim, and they put sandbags along the top of the bank on either side to try and make that bank even higher. But more water was flooding in the fens to the right of that road and was flooding across the fen until the outer parts of the bank acted as a dam. People said that bank's solid, that bank won't never burst, that bank will hold the water back. The fen, Hadnam Fen will be safe. And the bank didn't burst. But water got so high on the other side that just flooded right across the river bank, that flooded across the road, that flooded across the river, what was itself full from brim to brim, and that dropped down into the fen on the other side. And it's dropping into the fen that we call the Hadnam or the Hill Row Fen. And along that fen is a road, and along that road there are farms. And if you farmed along Hill Row, the water comes into your farmyard like a high tide at Hunstanton. And you try and sweep it back, but that won't stay back. And you're wondering what to do. And along come Ray Peg, the policeman, and he told you what to do. You've got to flit. Well, if there's one thing that fenmen do enjoy, it's being told what they have got to do by policemen. What do you mean flit? We've had flits before, you know. We had floods before, you know. We had floods in 1939. We had floods in 1937. We had floods in 1912. We got harvesting by boat that year, and we didn't flit then, and we ain't gonna flit now. Look out your window. What do you see? Oh, I don't see nothing. Look out your window. What do you see? Well, I see the rabbits are running, and I see the foxes are running, and blast the rats are running too, because behind them comes a tide of water. And if rats and rabbits run, then men must run. You're farmers. You take the important things. You take your cattle and your drills and your tractors. You take it out of that low fen up to that high land in the background, the high land of the island of Ely. And when you got the important things out, you go back for your furniture. And your wife says, "Shall I do me washing for I go?" And you say, "No, mother, no, you'd better go. You take the kiddies up to the top of the hill, and you stay and meet them airfield. But had a word with the experts, and they say we're going to have 18 inches of water in this house. I'm going to stay. You go." So you say goodbye to your family. And you're watching and you're waiting as that water comes across, and there's nothing you can do about it. It's just going to come. And as it comes across, you suddenly hear a baby crying, and you panic. You shouldn't need no babies. You're searching for them. You can't. What you find are two hares on a slightly raised bit of land, and the water is rising around them, and they're crying like babies. But you're in your bungalow and the water's around your ankles. And you think, well, we'll soon be there now. You're there when it's around your knees. You're saying, well, they said 18 inches. When it gets around your middle, you think, that's a bloomin' good 18 inches. you know you've got a flip. This isn't the sea, this is dry land between Erith and Hadner, and this is water, and water is washing up to the roofs of houses and washing over the roofs of houses. Here on the edge of the high land of the island of Ely are some of the people whose houses are out there, who are looking out over the sea. They knew how far the flood would come. Look where they left the tractors and their ploughs, on the edge of the island of Ely. You're looking out. You're wondering if you can see your place or whether you can't. It's 1947. It's not just happening on that stretch of road. If you look across to the village of Sutton, the village of Sutton Church looks like a lighthouse, and there people are evacuating. It's happening all over, not just in the Hadnam area. This is one picture. The thing that captures it is the caption, "Seen to close the gap in the north bank of the Little Ouse near Hockwold." After working all day, 1,000 men closed the gap with sandbags. After working all day, 1,000 men. It's happening also to the north of Ely on the main A10 road to Littleport, where, and beyond Littleport, towards Southerby, where it looks like a scene from the trenches. But what that is on the right is a dam that has been built using the A10 road as the main road to try and keep the water back. It's a dam that's been built by soldiers. And here the soldiers are manning that sandbag wall. And if a bank's going to burst at it's never going to burst at 2:30 in the afternoon. So at 2:30 in the morning, you're manning that barricade, and the water is throwing itself. And the might of the British Army can defeat nature. That barricade holds. But nature's sneaky, and she don't play fair, and she can't get you one way, she'll get you another. And under every road there are dikes and culverts. And the army had blocked those culverts. But there was one spot where there was just a little chink. There was just a little hole. And there wasn't a Dutch boy to put his finger in the hole. And water thrusting its way through compression is strong. It blew the road apart as though it had been hit by a bomb. And if he's a 5-foot high man, just see what a devastation. It released that water that had been pent up. This house was always on the wrong side. This house was always going to be wet. They put the furniture upstairs. But as the water surged past it to get through the hole, it just sucked the foundations down. In 1947, the Isle of Ely was an island again. You couldn't get off it even by water, because the water in the river is so high you can't get under the bridges. And that is largely caused by one hole in one river bank. It's a massive undertaking. It's an undertaking that now involves farmers, it now involves fenland, it now involves army men, it now involves Ger-men, because the German prisoners of war are fighting their part. On that gap that we've seen over, the only thing you can do is to try and stabilise it, try and stop it getting bigger. They've stabilised it. But until you can fill that gap, all the water that's coming down the rivers to the right is just going to run straight through that gap. It's going to run into over fen. It's going to overtake into hill row fen. And you've got to fill the gap. How on earth are you going to do it? Well, there's only one way you can do it, and that is to get on that bank. And the trouble is, there isn't a way onto that bank except that in the distance, there's a railway line. That's the railway line that runs from Bluntisham towards Willingham on. And that line is cut, but there's a bridge. And you can cross the bridge over this main river and get to where the... So being able to cross that bridge, you can get to where the battle line is. And if you're going to have a battle, you're going to need an army, and you can put that army together. At the end of that line is Bluntisham. Now, Bluntisham has a station. You can bring goods to that station. You can bring sandbags and tarpaulins to that station. You can get them to where they're needed. This is Bluntisham Station. You can see what sort of weather it is. It's not a basking March day. It's a freezing cold March day. The wind is whipping across. It's filling, people are being frozen to death. And you can imagine almost what these people are saying. Blast who'd be in the army. A few years ago, I was in the desert. I was with Rommel, and we had tanks. And somebody said, yeah, my old dad, he was in the First War, and they had tanks. And somebody said, well, they had tanks in the First War and tanks in the Second War. Why don't we use tanks in the Third War? They gathered troops together by the breach, but you've got to have something to put in that breach. And what they used was army tanks, buffalo tanks. They drove them down to the river, they put them into the river, and they drove those amphibious tanks along inside the river until they got to where the home was. And then they put one army tank down one side to fill one side, another tank down the other, and they drove a line of tanks to try and make a metal box around that hole. It was a massive piece of engineering. Tanks broke down. Things took far longer than they ever to have taken, and it was night before the gap was thought to be filled. Once they'd got that metal box, they put submarine nets outside the tanks. They put tarpaulins on the submarine nets. They held them down with sandbags. They hoped to make a watertight gap. It wasn't watertight. Water still got through, but they had bought slack water. Once they'd taken the pressure off, then they could fill in the hole. This was a major activity. It was being reported all over the country, and we needed a royal to come and look. So the Duke and Duchess of Gloucester were sent to come and say, well done, my man. The filling in that gap meant that you had to get galt or clay to that gap. The only way you could get it was down the river, but the river was full from brim to brim. You needed men who knew the way down the little channel that they couldn't see, the channel that marked the river rather than the channel that marked the wash. You need men who knew the fens like the back of their hands, who had the skill to bring lines of barges laden with clay to put in that hole. And through all that effort, it worked. The hole was filled in. The bank was made good. But the land was still flooded. The farmer said, my land's underwater. Yes, but what you need to do is to start your diesel pumps, start your steam. Yeah, but we ain't got enough pumps in the fens to pump this land dry. Well, look, there's one thing this country has, that's coal mines. Get the pumps out of the coal mines. So from all around England, pumps from clay mines, coal mines were brought to the fens. They were assembled on Ely Marketplace and they were driven out into the fens to suck water off land and pump it back into rivers. But we ain't got enough pumps in all England to pump the fens dry. So they sent across to Holland, and from over the sea to Sutton came giant pumps that would suck 300 tons of water a minute off the land. And where did the Dutch get them pumps? We give them to them. During the war, when the Germans had spiked the Dutch dikes and Holland were flooded, we sent them giant pumps and they sent them back. The pumps were placed in the fen. The only thing you could hear day after day after day was the sound of those pumps sucking water off the fields and pushing it back into the river and pushing it back into the river, and nothing happened. But then slowly a dry line formed. A dry line that marked the roads that run through the fens. Because in the fens, the roads are higher than the land is. And so the roads start to emerge. And when the roads start to emerge, you can appreciate the beauty of it. Yeah, that's real pretty. You ought to go and look at that. The way the sun just shimmers on the water. The way them old swans are, you ought to go and look at it. It has a wonderful sight to see. And people did go and see. They took their bikes and they biked and explored this wonderful watery landscape. And that is one thing to look at, but that's a different thing if that's your home. What if it is your home? Now, you know what the army boys have said. They've been out there on their ducks. They've told you, but you're not going to believe it until you can see it for yourself. So you get one of them boats that's appeared in the fens and you're heading out and you're wondering, what am I going to see? And there's my house. Last, that's my house. How, that's where I was when Ray Pegg said I had to flip, and I said, why? Yeah, but how can water do that to a house? And then you realise that in the fens a few years earlier you'd been digging for victory, and when you were digging for victory you'd been digging land that had never been ploughed before, and you'd struck them bog oaks, them old trees, and you'd pulled them up and laid them beside the road, and they'd floated. And they'd come into your house through the windows. Or the barns had collapsed and the sleepers had come into your house through the windows. And then the tide had caught them and sent them backwards and forwards and backwards and forwards until it smashed a hole through your house. And there's me bed. That's where I was when Ray Pegg said I had to flip. At last I could get up there. And you scramble onto the... Yeah, there I am on my bed. There's my bed just as I left it. There's old mattress. God bless. Last night looks as though there's body on that bed, don't there? Yeah, and there was. Yeah. Out of the body of my favourite cat. Yeah, my cat had been trapped on my mattress. And so had 1,000 rats. They let my cat have found ash bones. And then you look down and you realise that flood water is not clean water. That is muddy, slubby, smelly water. And you've got the scratching on the walls and the scratching on the windowsills where the rats have scrabbled. And you think, no, I'm not going back to that. I can't go back to that. I shan't go back to that. But the problem is that fenmen are awkward. That's why they call them tigers. They won't give up. And they do go back. And the men go back and they shovel the mud out and they shovel the slub out and they shovel the snakes out. And that snake, that was a devil, and we never did no good in that house, never no more. And the women go back. And you scrub the walls and you scrub the floors and you scrub the ceilings, and all you're doing is making it wetter. And the mould is growing. But that is your home, and you are going back. Then get an old roadman's hut and put it in the garden. And this is a national disaster. It's not just happening in the fens, but we're looking at the fens, and with a disaster comes relief. And there are collections. And with collections, there's money for compensation. There's money to repair barns. There's money to repair houses. You didn't repair your house. They repaired it for you. And you know what they say, them old fen farmers, they had nothing before the floods, they had everything after. I heard one of them say, last before the day before the Fen floods, we got a new three-piece suite of furniture. Yes, that come just before the flood. You didn't see it. That got washed away. We're going to put that down on the floor. Put that floor down on the floor, mother. And I'd been have a new suite, a new three-piece suit. Put that down, mother. Three. But what you've got to remember is that the fenmen don't take charity. They don't want your money. The fenman's got his pride. He'll stand on his own feet. But the problem of 47 was he couldn't. The men who had laboured during the war to feed the country were now forced to take handouts because they lost an entire harvest. In some places, they did manage to get crops that harvest off land that had been flooded. In the fen that we're looking at, they didn't. They had to take charity. They had to go a whole 18 months with nothing coming in. Next year we got wonderful crops. Yeah. Weeds grew 6 foot high, had to roll them before we could plough them in. And the crops that we got off that land were wonderful. You see, the fens had dried out and the floods had brought back the goodness. And we ought to have a flood every 5 years to revitalise the soil. And that was last year. Or is it this year? And no, that's not flood, is it? What do you mean that in flood? That looks like flood, that looks like water. No, that's not flood. That's plastic. That's fleece. Because nowadays, farming in the fens is high-tech. Farmers cover their fields with a sort of plastic in order to warm the soil to get the right temperature to grow crops effectively. You can't believe your eyes. It moves like it isn't. It's fleece. And since 1947, there has been a massive investment in infrastructure. The original Denver sluice that controlled the way that the water went out into the sea and controlled the seawater that came into the fens has been replaced or supplemented by a new, larger sluice and a brand new man-made river running parallel to the first tidal water out to the sea at Wisbech. And around the edge of the fen, they've dug a completely new river. And now the water that drains in the fens from Norfolk and Suffolk is picked up by this cut-off river and carried around the edge of the fen. And now they're confident that all the water that gets into the fen can get out to sea. No, it can't. Why? Because they're building so many houses now. They're building so many houses in places like Essex, and then houses are being moved in by people from London, and some of them, they want a bath every fortnight. And we ain't got enough water. So now, as part of the fen system, the water that flows down the river does not have to go to sea. It can be pumped the wrong way down the cut-off channel. And just around the corner, there's an underground pipe, and that carries the water to the other side of Newmarket. And then it's pumped over the hills to Essex, and Essex people drink it. So carry on putting all your nitrates and the fertilizer in the water, that's going to go down. And anyway, we can control nature now. Anyway, we can tell what's going to happen, and we can plan for the future. We can plan houses on floodland. And of course, that won't ever flood again. Not till the next time. Not till 1998. Well, 1998 was virtually the same as 1947, except a slightly different part of the fen. And you are going to be a very brave person who says the fens will not flood again. I think they will flood again. And when they flood again, it will be worse than 1947. And it's the fault of these men. It's their fault because they've got old. In 1947, we had men who knew what hard work was. We'd got farmers and army men and men. Men who had stood on river banks and shoveled mud while they were frozen to death in order to keep their bank secure. And I'm not sure we got those men anymore. When it happens again, I'm not going to be turning out in the middle of the night to shovel mud. And I don't think I'm going to be turning out to look at it. But one man did that, and that man was Walter Martin Lane. In 1947, he had a vision that the floods would come again, and he went out with his camera. And with his camera, he travelled into the fen to take pictures to show the devastation and capture the stories of some of the families. And something over 50 years ago, Walter gave his pictures to me for passing on to the Cambridgeshire collection. And through his eyes, you've got a picture. Through his eyes, I can talk for 40 minutes about a few days in 47 that we would otherwise totally forget about. And when you think what is the future for the fens, the map that the experts come up with is the map that we started from. An area of low-lying land that's gone back underwater. And you can say, well, why? What will cause that? Is it going to be another tsunami that forces the water into the fens down the rivers from the Wash? or is it going to be the fenman's oldest enemy, the build-up of mud? Because where two dikes meet, when water draws into water, it builds up a bank of mud, and that bank. So what is the future of the fens? Well, if you're going to live in the fens, well, that's not all bad, is it? If you're going to buy a house in the fens, just make sure where you buy it, because think what you can sell it for. If you can sell it with a sea view. And the problem is that may be next year. The fens are a fascinating area. They're just a small part of Cambridgeshire. And I have great privilege to try and understand just a little bit of it. And it's been a great privilege to have an opportunity